Welcome to everyone who's joining. We will get started in just 1 minute, right at 1 o'clock. Hey, thank you all for joining us today. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Tanya Haruya. She's going to do our welcoming karakia.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi mahana ki a koutou. I tēnei rā, nau mai haere mai ki tēnei hui a ipurangi, nau mai haere mai ki Tracy, and it gives me great pleasure to open up our session today with a karakia, me inoi tātou. Tū taua mai I runga, tū taua mai I raro, tū taua mai I roto, tū taua mai I waho. Kia tau ai, te Māori tū, te Māori ora, ki te katoa, haumie huie tāiki e.
Thank you so much, Tanya. Kia ora katoa. I'm Ragnar Anderson. I'm from Sexual Wellbeing, Aotearoa. Super pleased to have you all here for our second in our series on sexual and reproductive health over the life course. I am super pleased, honored, and just overjoyed, really, that Dr. Tracy Morrison has agreed to present for us today, talking about why we need reproductive justice in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Just a quick bio of Tracy. She's an associate professor and director of the master's program in health psychology at Massey University. She trained as a research psychologist at Rhodes University in South Africa, where she also earned her doctoral degree in 2010. She remains affiliated with Rhodes University as an honorary research associate of the Critical Studies in Sexuality and Reproduction program. She is also editor-in-chief of Feminism and Psychology, a leading international journal. Her primary research area is sexual and reproductive health, spanning the areas of feminist, critical, and health psychology. Her work is focused on how to identify structural and systemic problems that need to be addressed to support sexual and reproductive rights and justice. She does this using qualitative research methods which help show the social context of sexual and reproductive relationships, practices, and decisions. She is interested in how people's different social identities, such as gender, race, class, etc., affect how they can have relationships, make decisions, and act in ways that have to do with sexuality and reproduction. So with that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Morrison, and thank you very much. And please just note, we will have an opportunity for questions at the end, so jot them down. Don't be shy. I'm not going to do it through the chat. I'm just going to let people ask questions on their own if they so wish. So over to you, Tracy.
Kia ora right now. Tēnā koutou, kua hui mai nei tēnā rā, no Europa o ko tipuna, I whānau mai o Impangeni, I tipu aku o Ganubi. No reira ko Amerika ki te tonga, toko whenua tipu, ko Tracy, toko ingoa, ko Morrison, te ingoa o toko whānau, I tēnei wā kei te oka hukukura, kei te tamaki makoro, aho noho ana. Kei te kuninga ki purua o mahi ana. No reira tēnā koutou, tēnā ana tātou katoa. So for those who may not know me, as Ragnar indicated, my name is Tracy Morrison, and my family is of European descent, like many people living in Aotearoa. But I was born in a small town off the east coast of South Africa called Empangeni, and raised mostly, I had a bit of a nomadic family, but mostly in a even smaller seaside village further down the coast called Ganubi. I now live in the Big Smoke in Auckland and work at Massey University in the School of Psychology. So yeah, I'm really honored to be here today. And thanks to Sexual Wellbeing for the invitation to share my work. And this is really pulling on different strands of work that I've been working on for probably the last decade or so, which makes me feel a bit old. Yeah, so, gotta get the slides working. So in this korero, I want to reflect on, as Ragnar said, why we need reproductive justice here in Aotearoa and beyond. So I'm going to draw on some of the research that I've been involved in, firstly on contraceptive service provision, and then on experiences of older, voluntarily childless or child-free women. And I'll use those terms interchangeably. So just thinking about the lifespan, we've got kind of different bookends of the spectrum showing up in this talk. And what I'm going to do is try and open up a conversation about what it means to create just, equitable and respectful conditions for reproductive decision making. So before I start, I just want to offer a gentle invitation. As you listen today, I would encourage you to notice not just what you agree or disagree with, but also where you might feel discomfort, curiosity, or recognition. Reproductive justice invites us not just to ask, what do I believe, but whose stories do I listen to, and whose reproductive lives are made possible or constrained by the systems within which I work and live. So I thought I could start with a story that, well, a story, if only it were a story, a news story that you might have seen in the headlines. Last year, the Prime Minister urged New Zealanders to have more babies. So the words are on the slide, his exact words. I encourage all of you to go out there and have more babies if you wish. That would be helpful. So that sounds like a wonderful pro-family, pro-future statement. But I was quite bemused because at the same time, I noticed that the same year, some of the coalition members called for harsher penalties for those who keep having children while receiving welfare. So what are we to make of this contradiction? On the one hand, the government is encouraging people to reproduce, and on the other hand, it's penalizing people for doing just that, if they're not the right kind of people. So reproduction is being celebrated for some and problematized for others. And if we zoom out, a pattern emerges. Over the past decade, New Zealand governments have introduced welfare reforms that specifically target working class women and those on benefits, many of whom are Māori and Pacifica women. And these reforms have included free access to long-acting reversible contraception, or LARCs. And of course, we want to improve access to contraception, but not as part of sanctions for having more children while on the benefits. Now, this pattern is not new or limited to our country, and it's certainly not neutral. So the New Zealand-based sociologist Foreman Marriott notes that this is an example of the selective application of pronatalism, where some populations are encouraged to have children and others are discouraged or surveilled. And these patterns reflect deep-seated ideas about who deserves to reproduce and under what conditions. So I want to ask, what would it look like to value all reproductive lives, to support people to have children or not on their own terms? What would it mean to center justice rather than control? And that's where the framework of reproductive justice offers us a different path. So many of you will probably be aware that the reproductive justice framework is gaining traction globally. For example, the High-Level Commission at the Nairobi Summit adopted the sexual and reproductive justice framework as a unifying framework in their work. Their 2023 report explicitly calls for justice and not just rights to be at the center of global development. And then last year, some of you may have attended, Sexual Wellbeing Aotearoa co-hosted the launch of the UNFPA report using this very framework, and actually found that report while I was cleaning up my office. So it's definitely something that's, as I said, gaining traction, and it's quite important to understand, therefore, what reproductive justice is about. So I want to spend a few moments doing just that. The term reproductive justice is not new at all. It was coined in the 1990s by Black or African American women activists in the US. And they developed this framework, started out really as an activist movement, for two main reasons. They had two key issues. So the first one was that they were frustrated with this narrow focus on choice in mainstream reproductive rights movements. And they pointed out, so I mean, that would then be things like my body, my choice, the right to choose. And what they pointed out is critical, that choice is never exercised in a social vacuum. It's one thing to say someone has the right to choose, but what if they don't have access to services? What if their choices are shaped by poverty, racism, colonization, or violence? So essentially, what if the conditions that make real choice possible are missing? So then the second issue that sparked this movement was the intense focus on abortion access in mainstream reproductive rights movements. So they pointed out that for many Black and Indigenous women, there are more urgent concerns than abortion. And this would be protection from coercive control over reproduction. And this resonates really strongly with the history of Aotearoa, where we've seen policies like sterilization, family caps, and child removals. So what they were really highlighting is the core issue that I started with, and that is whose reproduction is valued and whose is devalued or controlled. So they said, in addition to the right not to have children through abortion or contraception, we should have an expanded vision. And they added the right to have children and to care for them in safe and supportive environments. So what we have the reproductive justice framework doing is bringing together the idea of reproductive rights with social justice. And what's really crucial about that is it recognizes that these rights are shaped by power. There are systematic inequalities that are based on people's ethnicity, their race, their class, and so on. And reproductive justice shifts the conversation away from only individual rights to look at how those rights are situated within systems of power. So when we talk about reproductive justice, we're not just saying, did that person get to choose? We're asking who has the ability to make decisions about their bodies and lives and who doesn't? What are the conditions of that choice? Whose choices are supported and whose are scrutinized? Who has access? Who faces stigma? And who is silenced? So our goal is not just about better access to services. I mean, that certainly is one, but it's also about changing the systems that prevent people from living self-determined lives where parenting or not parenting is equally supported and respected. So I want to illustrate with just drawing on some of my research. First, I want to talk about a transnational study that I conducted here in Aotearoa and in South Africa with Dr. Yanela Ndobula and Professor Katrina McLeod, and they're both from the Critical Studies in Sexuality and Reproduction group at Rhodes University. So we interviewed contraceptive service users and healthcare providers about how long-acting reversible contraception is offered and discussed in clinical settings. And we also explored women's experiences of consultations, counseling and decision-making around LARC. So most people here will probably know LARC includes very highly effective methods like the IUD, intrauterine device, contraceptive implant, or injectable contraception like Depo-Provera. And what we found in the study is that power dynamics shape contraceptive care. And our participant stories, both the providers and the service users, suggest that the ability to make decisions about contraception was limited in two ways. So first, we have what we probably are all aware of and familiar with, is that unequal power between patients and providers, where health professionals are seen as the experts and have more say in decision-making. So this is illustrated in one of the participants' accounts, Kiara, here in Aotearoa. And she said, it really was a lot of doctor, nurse-led, this is what we think is going to be best for you. If I'd said to my doctor then, no, I don't want to be on the jab, they would have been like, well, we don't think that's a good option. And when a doctor says that, you just nod and agree. So the second way that choice was limited was through broader structural power, social power differentials. And these are especially related to age and race or ethnicity. And it's really vividly demonstrated in the following quotes. Oh, sorry, I skipped ahead. So Gutle in South Africa said, when you're being discharged from a hospital, they inject you. She's talking about Depo-Provera. In fact, they don't tell you and they don't beg you, especially if you are a child and you have a child. They don't beg you. They don't ask you if you want it or not. And then similarly here in Aotearoa, Sandra said, I think I didn't have a choice about using LARC in the end because I was Māori and young and out of school. Like they just assumed I'm going to be another teenage mother. So that was the service providers. But when we looked at the data from the service users, when we looked at the data from the service users, what we found was that service providers generally spoke the language of patient-centered care or woman-centered care, however they understood it. But at the same time, they were also engaging or spoke about engaging in subtle and sometimes not so subtle forms of persuasion. And you can see some of the snippets from quotes on the slide. So sexual health nurse saying, I tried to push and sell long-term contraception, and that idea of pushing and selling was very common. I think if you can push them a little bit, there's echoing that. And then public sector gynae saying, LARCs are great for people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, Māori and Pacific Island women. So some of the participants described encouraging particular patients to use LARC, like we see in the quote from Gavin, because it would protect them from themselves. Direct quote. Others implied that women who were poor, young, or already had children shouldn't be left to decide for themselves. And providers often celebrated success rates, not in terms of informed choice, but in terms of how many women had accepted a LARC. And this is where reproductive justice is so helpful. It gives us a way to name what we see happening here. Because when services are offered selectively or accompanied by judgment or target some groups more than others, then access does not equal autonomy. So let me just pause and ask you to reflect whether you have ever thought of contraception as a form of control, maybe not just for individuals, but at the population level. Who is usually seen as needing it the most, and who is seen as irresponsible if they don't use it? fighting with the slides. So I want to come back to the idea of population control later on, but for now, let's shift to a different group, the older women who have never had children. And this is drawing on work more recently that I've done here in Aotearoa with my master's student, Jackie Witton. And she interviewed older women who are voluntarily childless and had all passed their childbearing years. So the youngest person in the cohort was 50, and they ranged all the way into their 70s. And their stories show how pronatalism, this idea that motherhood is the natural or ideal path that all women should take, continues to shape expectations across the life course. So, for instance, Laura shared a story about being asked at church if she had children, and I'll share that with you. She said, I was actually up north in Paihia a couple of years ago, and there was a guy at church up there, and he said, oh, do you have children? And I said, no, I never wanted children. I remember his face was like, what? Like, what's wrong with you? This man's shocked reaction made Laura hesitate, and she says that she briefly wondered if she should be less open about her reproductive status. And then she thought, no, this is who I am. But over the years, she had noticed that in environments like a church where marriage and motherhood are tightly linked, her choice stands out more. She recalls feeling pressured early in her marriage by constant questions about when she would have kids. And at one point, just to shut people down, she said, I can't have children, because she knew that response would be met with sympathy instead of judgment. So now in her 60s, Laura reflects on how liberating it is not to care so much about other people's reactions. But she's also very clear that throughout her life, when she said she didn't want children, people's reactions would reveal deep assumptions that we hold about women and motherhood. So, like Laura, the participants reported that they now are now that they're no longer able to have children, this kind of invasive questioning, pressure, and judgment has eased and become less frequent. But some said that they still experienced assumptions and questioning, pity, or even subtle blame. Others mentioned that not having grandchildren has become the focus, or that they're now seen as old and obsolete. So we can see this in Jill's quote here. She says, in the early years, people tried to convince me I was missing out and that I'd regret it. Sometimes, just to shut them up, I'd say, I can't have children. Then they'd say, oh, I'm so sorry. And I'd go, no, it's fine. I didn't want them either. Or the opportunity didn't arise. I just wanted to shut down the conversation. People would say things like, you'd be such a good mother, as if they felt sorry for me, like I'd missed out on the joy of motherhood. But I never ask people, why did you have children? Then once you hit 40, you get cast as the old spinster, like you're past it. There's definitely some sexism in how childless women are seen. And I think if you're past it when you're 40, that's quite it feels quite extreme. But we didn't only see these negative experiences, we also saw what we call soft resistance. And this is where instead of challenging or confronting these norms directly, the women explain their choices in rational, personalized ways that maintain social respectability while still resisting this demand to mother. So we saw it as a kind of quiet refusal. So just to pause and think for a moment, how do these stories land with you? Perhaps you felt the need to justify a reproductive decision, or maybe you've noticed how others feel entitled to ask, why don't you have children? But never, why did you? So this brings me to a broader point. At first glance, these two examples seem quite different. Some women being pressured to use contraception and others being judged for not having children. But both are shaped by the same underlying logic, pronatalism with rules, or the selective application of pronatalism. It's not simply that motherhood is celebrated universally, it's that some motherhood is celebrated and other forms are scrutinized or discouraged. Pronatalism doesn't just stigmatize those who don't have children, it also pressures people into having them, some people. Maybe before they're ready, or maybe to have more children than they want. Just ask parents of only children who are told that their child is going to be developmentally challenged because it doesn't have a sibling, or that you're being selfish. So really, these are not separate struggles. And what we see here is what the theorist Chantal Mouffe calls a chain of equivalence. So this is when seemingly distinct experiences are linked by shared structures of control. So in this case, selective pronatalism. Another scholar, Chandra Mohanty, builds on this idea, and she reminds us of the need for common feminist struggle cross-difference, across these and along these chains of equivalence. So whether it's poor women being pressured into contraception or older women being judged for not having children, the underlying system is the same: reproductive governance shaped by inequity. And the irony of this is that often women are pitted against one another, where mothers and non-mothers are portrayed as opposites, when in fact we really are confronting the same system that narrowly defines what a good reproductive choice looks like. So my argument really is that until both reproduction and non-reproduction can be seen as legitimate choices, no choice is truly free. So coming back to reproductive justice, what would it mean to bring reproductive justice into practice, into our policy, services, and even wider public attitudes? It would mean offering contraception of all kinds without judgment and without pressure. It would mean supporting people to parent and supporting people who choose not to. It would mean listening to what people actually want rather than assuming based on their age, income, ethnicity, or their body. It would also mean removing punitive policies like the sanctions for welfare beneficiaries who have more children. And more than anything, it would mean shifting from control to care, from seeing reproduction as a problem that needs to be managed to a right that needs to be supported. So I want to close by returning to the contradiction that I began with. Have more babies, says the Prime Minister, unless you're young, poor, Māori, or receiving support. And this contradiction is not accidental. It reflects the logic of a system that wants the outcomes of reproduction: labour, citizens, continuity, but only from some people and only on its terms. Reproductive justice gives us another way forward. It asks us to centre dignity, not discipline, to work in solidarity across difference, and to imagine a world where all reproductive lives are valued. So I'll leave you with a question. What would it take, not just to protect reproductive rights, but to build reproductive justice? And what might your role be in helping that happen? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tracy. That is a lot to think about. Immediately, I have like 5 ways that could be supported that I'd love to get into. Before I ask my questions, I want to open up the floor. So if anyone has a question that they would like to ask, if you could just go to the heart-shaped react button, click on that, and hit raise your hand. That would be great. Thank you for that, Tracy. Now we can all see one another, which is lovely. Does anyone have any reflections or questions that they would like to offer at this time? Okay, well, I'll kick us off then immediately because I am currently working on sexual well-being submission to the government. I was thinking about the role of sexuality education and ensuring that all people, women, girls, boys, men, understand how to prevent or how they might pursue having a child even through non-traditional means. So I feel like in terms of those axes and sort of with your final question of what would it take, I think education is a really important part of that and ensuring that people even understand, for example, that, contraception may, not all forms of contraception actually protect you from STIs, which can also have an effect on your fecundity and fertility. So that's one thought that sprang to my mind is sort of on a policy level, what are the sort of axes of information that we're communicating to young people from the very start of schooling? So is there anyone else who has a question? Or Tracy, do you want to comment
Yeah,
on
just to add to that, Ragnar, I mean, it's a good point to say all people, because, I mean, reproductive justice did start with, women of color, and of course my work has focused on women for particular reasons. But yes, I mean, it is an issue that, touches on people of all genders. So yeah, good point to make as well.
Any other questions or comments, given some of the questions that Tracy posed to us?
So Ragnar, when you say your policy, people supporting people, which particular groups are you looking at? Sort of non-heterosexual people? Sorry, that's a terrible word to use. Or are you looking at fertility, or?
I was sort of thinking of all of the above. I mean, right now, my brain is very focused on relationships and sexuality education in schools. And thinking about when young kids are sort of allowed, if you will, in that context to learn about these various dimensions of sexual and reproductive health and rights, and kind of the current ways in which some of that is being pulled back a bit, or a representation of gender diverse or various sexual identities sort of being pulled back, which is reflective of the larger global sort of rise of conservatism around issues. So I was thinking of that, but then also thinking, I mean, there's a lot, even with questions around IVF and how those intersect, it seems now, with issues of abortion. So you have kind of maybe unlikely bedfellows now in thinking about reproductive justice and who is able to access that, and sort of the intersection of reproduction and technology as well, which I think is a fascinating and area that is now being scrutinized by politicians. So politicians making healthcare and reproductive decisions on behalf of millions of people. Sue, I'm going to hand it over to you.
I just had a question. I guess that I'm involved with running a service, and in these days of resource constraint, we tend to prioritise our populations, but with reproductive issues, I suppose, it's very difficult. You're running a tightrope because by prioritizing some of our ethnic populations, then you're at risk of not providing reproductive justice, and yet it's done with the very best of intentions that you can't have choice if you don't have access.
It's
just a really tricky.
It is tricky. I agree with you. And I mean, that's the thing, is you want to open up access, but you don't want to do it in coercive ways. So targeting particular kinds of groups, I mean, it can be problematic if you are saying that group is the problem. But if it's, say, an underserved population, then that's a different story. And really the fundamental kind of issue that I think reproductive justice activists would point out there is your point that it's because you have limited resources. And what reproductive justice is saying as well is that you've got to look at the broader context, right? can people make the choices they want to make? Well, why not? Because there isn't enough funding and there aren't enough resources. So, I mean, even things like rolling back sexuality education. I mean, I suppose reproductive justice advocates would say it's the government's responsibility and civil society's responsibility to support people's sexual and reproductive health and rights. And that would include things like comprehensive services, comprehensive sexuality education. So I don't think it's not reproductive justice aligned, I guess, to rationalize your resources, I suppose. But it's just about how you go about it. So yeah, using LARC as part of welfare sanctions, for example, for me is problematic because there's a potential there for it to be coercive. But yes, I agree. It's a tricky one.
Joe, please go ahead. If I have your name right, I think that's Joe who's raised their hand.
Oh, and you just need to unmute.
Yeah. Dora, can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Sorry, my husband's just in the room, hence the headphones, but he's now left. Kia ora, Tracy. I'm Joe, and sexual and reproductive health specialist, just retraining in IUDs along with Sue Tushy, who just asked questions. And I am working at the Mangere contraception, training at the Mangere contraception clinic, where I really struggled one day with a young person who was postnatal and came in for her, she was requesting a Jadel, and the trainer with me noted that I was really, it was such a fine line to be, you know, she's young, Māori, she has 2 children, she was severely iron deficient and had pretty horrendous periods, and everyone had talked to her about the Morena. I'm Māori myself and spent a lot of time doing you know, thinking about how to be culturally safe on an individual level, not at a national level. And it was really challenging for myself to make sure that we did end up doing exactly what this young person wanted. In the end, she did decide to go with Morena, but it took a lot longer. And I think the purpose of my reflection is that we actually need to allow time for that kōrero.
Yeah.
And how do we do so in a service level? This particular one, she wasn't the safe time to put the IUD in, but you know, that was still a 45-minute appointment to make sure that I got to her values and the why about why she didn't particularly want it, and we did get there. And I think in the end we were, you know, she knew that it was whatever she wanted I would do. But I really did struggle with that. And that's from someone who's, you know, spent 25 years thinking about all of the stuff that you're talking about.
Yeah.
So I think from a service level, it's how do we ensure that we're giving people, particularly our vulnerable to coercion people, enough time to make that, because she'd had lots of information prior to coming to see us. So that would be my one service level thing, is allowing time people to make good decisions, and for practitioners to practice in the way that is actually really values-based. And really, I love that term, dignity, not discipline. I mean, I've written down so many fabulous terms. That's all I just wanted to say. Kia ora. It's incredible talk. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I mean, that's also a really important point. And I mean, I cut some stuff out of the talk, and I see now I probably had some time to put it in. But it is important to note, and I talk about this when I wrote up the research, that service providers do want to do the best for their patients. They are, like Sue said, have the best of intentions, and are working within a system that doesn't often support them. So time is absolutely important and crucial if you're going to talk about things like person-centered care. and values-based decision making, those kinds of things. And again, it comes back to the issue of resourcing. And when you're a GP, which I spoke to as well, and you've got a 15-minute window, how the heck are you supposed to do that kind of thing? So there are very real structural and systemic constraints, and I think that is the value of the reproductive justice lens, is it's saying let's look beyond the interpersonal level, where there are these we're not blaming service providers per se, but we're zooming out and we're saying, like, what's going on in the system. So I think that's a really, really important and valuable point. Thank you.
Thank you, Jo. Nice to put a face to a name too.
Yeah.
And anybody else have any questions or comments? Deborah.
Kia ora koutou. Apologies, the sun is so bright and on my screen I can barely see what I'm doing. I could move, but I've decided not to do that. Look, thank you for that talk, Tracy. I love the following kōrero with the people who have contributed in this chat. One of the things I think with reproductive justice, given the fact that I'm now in my 40th year of concentrating in the field of endometriosis, I really feel it's an opportune time to raise this in the whole field of reproductive justice, because when we have, at least, and Australia have proven otherwise, that our incidence is probably more like 1 in 7, we go with the 1 in 10 incidence rate of endometriosis. And when we know that the disease starts so young, and often from the first menstrual period, then I think that menstrual conditions outside gynae cancers need to be considered when we're talking about reproductive justice, because it could be that perceived coercion, or those examples that you told us about, that those people are also presenting with symptoms in line with, dysmenorrhea for a start, but certainly that may also be conditions relating to their reproduction and their reproductive health and their menstrual health. So I think that we can't actually confine this to reproductive justice without also considering those things. And again, it comes down to education. So it's just my little input into the conversation, but I really loved that talk. And I loved the fact that you gave us time to consider those things, because I'm sure that we all sat around and actually got the cogs turning. So kia ora.
Kia ora. Yeah, I mean, Deborah, I suppose that is something just to add, and I don't want to hog the thing. If other people have comments there, also give them a chance. But yeah, I mean, I use the term more in my work of sexual and reproductive justice, because I feel like that's a little bit more encompassing, and probably for similar reasons to why family planning changed to sexual well-being. And, just to include a whole wider raft of issues that could be incorporated under the framework.
Thank you, Deborah. Anyone else have another comment or thought? Question? Okay. Well, it seems like we may have come to our natural conclusion. Before we do our closing karakia with Tanya, I just want to say thank you once again to Tracy for sharing your research and your insights into this really important and really, I think, sort of way to interconnect all of these different factors and sort of help to put them in a framework that can be really useful when making all sorts of cases or thinking about the work that we do in this sort of various pockets of sexual and reproductive health and rights. I also want to thank everybody for coming and engaging, and just keep your eye out for future webinars. Deborah will be presenting to us in a couple of months, actually, on endometriosis. So really appreciate your time, and we'll hand it over to Tanya.
Kia ora, Ragnar. Yeah, just briefly before we close with karakia, Tracy, just wanted to acknowledge your kōrero, but also to acknowledge the fact that we bonded in Parliament over demanding an acknowledgement of the impact of colonisation on reproductive justice in Aotearoa. It was a little bit prickly there for a little bit, wasn't it, Tracy? It was quite funny. We had an MP sitting in between us, and we were like pushing. So I just want to acknowledge your mahi, but also to make a statement around like Joe, I've written down a couple of really awesome sound bites that find really beneficial in chucking out, and I will acknowledge you for those sound bites, Tracy. But I think when we pull out and look at our systems and structures, and Joe alluded to it, how much are those systems and structures influenced by colonial stereotypes of reproduction in Aotearoa? And if we are really honest, it's huge. So I was thinking about the quote from one of your participants, the Māori woman in her 60s, who said that that person couldn't even believe that they didn't have any children. But in a mātauranga world, I'm sure she has tamariki for days that she cares for like a fire. So I think that our next steps in this conversation in this space is around considering the impact of that colonial lens, particularly in Aotearoa, but also globally with many other Indigenous nations that have the same experience. So thank you, Tracy, for your mahi in this space, and thank you to everybody for coming along to our webinar, and also to Ragnar for organising and being a champion in this space for us at Sexual Wellbeing Aotearoa. So I will just close us with karakia. So kia whakaria te tapu, kia wātea ai te ara, kia tūruki whakataha ai, kia tūruki whakataha hai. Haumie huie tāiki e.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much, and hope to see you again. Thank you, Tracy.
Thanks for having me. Thanks everyone for coming.
Bye. Ka kite.
Thank you.
Oh.